Hello boys and girls, friends old and new, welcome back to the channel. My name is Stian and today we have a beautiful old watch on the bench. It's a triple calendar Orator watch from the 1950s. And it's an eBay find, if I can call it that. It was affordable. And I guess there is a reason. It looked good in the pictures, but nothing really seems to work. Well, actually the moon phase corrector does work, but that's pretty much it. The crown is stuck, so we cannot set the time, we cannot wind the watch doesn't run. So let's see what's happening. At least the balance does oscillate, even though it stops very fast. We tried to get the crown and stem out, but that is pretty much impossible. So we put some WD-40 in there, trying to release the stem that way. And while we let that work a little bit, we're going to take off the bezel and the crystal. The dial actually looks pretty nice, but we do see there is some debris on the dial. And it looks like some kind of dirt or rust. And I think the best word to describe that is probably uh-oh. Well, actually those are two words. So trying to get the stem out, it really doesn't want to come. So in the end we have to use brute force, which is something we don't really want to use with a watch, but I think it's clear why the stem didn't want to come out. This is clearly a diver's watch. So not a diving watch, but a diver's watch. And yes, you can hear the birds in the background. They're a big improvement over the dog. But the video was actually started last year already. So I had to put it on hold for quite a while, and I'll get back to that later why. But we do see that there is a bit of rust in the movement. And we only scratched the surface. Well, hopefully we didn't scratch the surface, but there is a lot more under here, unfortunately. But that's how it typically is as well. Now the movement is a Valjoux 90. And the 90 is, let's say, the non-chronograph version of the 88, which again is built on the old 23. It was a relatively common caliber for triple calendar watches. And I mentioned that the brand of this watch is Orator. And you might have heard that name before, at least those who have watched the Hebdoma video. Because the Orator, the brand, was also the name of the movement in the Hebdoma. It was called the Orator 1. And in advertising for this watch, Schilt then also mentioned the Hebdoma watch. And these watches are pretty rare. I've seen one on Chrono24 for like 1100 euros, and visually it's in much worse shape. I got this one from eBay for dramatically less than that, but I'm beginning to think there is a reason for that. Anyway, as I have said before, if the dial is good and the balance is good, then a lot can be done with the watch. So let's see what we can do with this one. If you have seen the Hebdoma video, you might recall that one also had quite a bit of rust. but not as much as this one. And you haven't seen much yet. And of course, a question that arises then is how bad is rust for a watch? Can we basically just remove it and be happy and have the watch run again? Well, depends on how much rust we do find. And oh, we hit the jackpot! Whee! That's the mother lode right there. And it is very common. If you have water damage in the watch, it typically does come in through the crown, through the stem. And there are a few reasons for that. But most important is that this watch was, of course, never really meant to be waterproof. That's one thing. In screw-down crown watches, it's quite common to forget to screw down the crown, or don't screw it properly, or damage the threads, that kind of thing. But in old watches, of course, the rubber gasket inside the crown will at some point also deteriorate. And at that point, of course, if you do get the watch really wet, you will have water damage. Now, given that we cannot use the crown to let down the mainspring, we're going to have to basically hold the wheels back after we took off the pallet fork. And we see there's power on the mainspring, but the wheels obviously do not run so well, so there's some rust probably in the wheels also. Or maybe just old gunk and stuff like that. Yeah, this took a while.
Let's use the power of fast forward.
So going back to my question, how bad is rust? The short answer is it depends. And the long answer is for old watches, it can be pretty bad. This is already a 70-year-old watch. I'm not sure of the exact date of this watch or exact year, but probably early 50s. And getting parts for a watch like this, it's a challenge. And the reason it's a challenge is basically because as a watchmaker, when you do this for a living, you have to have a commercial attitude or balance to whatever you do. And finding new parts when they are no longer produced can be very costly. And while we're on the subject, oh, more trouble in paradise. So if we do have to buy all these parts, as we probably would do in a new watch where parts are readily available and frequently quite cheap, for this watch it would cost you probably $1,000 if you could even find it, and you probably couldn't. You'd have to buy at least one donor movement, maybe a couple. So we are going to try to salvage what is possible to salvage. And then, yeah, we'll see how that turns out. Now, I did have a similar case in the Rust Bucket Challenge, which was also a diver's watch. That's also not a diving watch. See, some of these screws are very stuck. Even with this Schraubenlöser, we're not really able to get everything entirely smooth and operational, but we do manage to get it loose.
Papa, this cement posing is on the grass.
As countless women have told me, that was fast. So I'm already back, getting the swimming thing off the grass again. And no, we don't swim in March in Switzerland. So as mentioned, this video was actually started last year. And that's probably the best indication of how long it took to get the rust off these parts. Now, in terms of whether this watch has been serviced, probably has. But this mainspring is not from this century and barely from the last one. These nice purple old style mainsprings are very nice, but they're not as good obviously as new ones. So we are going to put in a new mainspring. Now I mentioned that the movement is actually part of a chronograph family. Just that they removed the chronograph parts to make this kind of a dress watch triple calendar. But the whole winding setup is still as in their chronographs. So the ratchet wheel, the crown wheel, the click, everything is underneath the bridge. And that's also why it's difficult to let down the mainspring when the stem does not work. Now with the parts all laid out, how do we remove the rust? Anyone for tea? Yes, that's right. We're going to use some tea. Without sugar and without cream. And we're going to put all the screws in as well. And basically everything we took out of this movement. Just get it in there. And then we're going to let it soak for a while. And we see from the color that the tea has indeed absorbed quite some rust. But it still looks in pretty bad shape. So we're going to have to turn to some commercial products. So this is Bergeon rust remover. And after letting it soak there for even a while later, we're going to start using our fiber brush. Now there are various ways of doing this kind of work, of course. Some like to use bicarbonate of soda, for instance, as well. Various products can, of course, be used. There are specific rust removers that probably cost a lot less than this Bergeon stuff as well, and maybe even work better. But this is manual work, takes quite a lot of time. So let's just zoom through most of this. But with a glass fiber brush and with a simple pegwood stick, it is possible to get the parts back in working order. There will be some staining on some of the parts. Most of them will look pretty good actually. And staining is not an issue. That's just a color change in the metal. And of course, if the rust goes so deep that the integrity of the parts are in question, then you will have to replace them no matter what. But for now, let's get this bad boy into the cleaner. And while the cleaning machine does its work, let's turn to the case and the crystal. You might remember that the crystal showed some damage as well. And of course the case isn't all that clean. It is in nice condition though. It's not too badly worn. So we're just going to clean the three parts of the case. Alright, with the movement parts back from the cleaning machine, we can put in a new mainspring. We don't necessarily have to put in grease when we have a new mainspring like this. That should be lubricated from the factory. So don't overdo the grease at least. Could we have reused that old mainspring? Yes, we probably could. It actually looked in good condition. But the thing is, even tiny little spots of rust that are basically invisible would be damaging to the integrity of the mainspring. And this watch has enough challenges as it is, so we might as well just eliminate one of the possible causes of it running badly. We put the shock settings back in, and we're going to test the balance, and it seems to be okay. Or why are you looking so long at that, buddy? Uh-oh. Well, lo and behold, another little problem. And by little, I mean the size of the part, because the hairspring, the balance spring, is also a little bit damaged. We see the end of it is a little bit crooked, but perhaps the worst thing is that the stud is tilted. So we're going to have to manipulate the hairspring a little bit. Now keep in mind that this is really open heart surgery. This is the most delicate part in the watch. And it has been damaged, so the question is how well we can actually make it in the end. To fix this stud, it was not possible to simply try to tilt it back. So we're going to have to take the hairspring off the stud. And when we put a new stud in, a new pin in the stud rather, we want to make sure that one of the sides is a little bit flattened. We flatten it by filing it a little bit, filing our fingertip in the same process. So when the flat side is against the hairspring, then it will force the hairspring to be flat inside the stud. Now this is really fiddly work. Keep in mind that this hairspring, the whole diameter of it is less than 1 centimeter. But we do manage to pin it in the end. But wait, there is more. The index pin is also crooked. As we went through in a little bit detail in the Longines mono pusher video, you do want to have the hairspring line in the center between the index and the boot. So you might actually have to bend the pin, but then you want it to be parallel and not bending towards the boot like you saw here. So we straighten it, and then we can put the hairspring back on the balance. We're going to use a staking tool for that, and then we can check the overall health. Uh-oh. This really is the gift that keeps on giving. We see the pivots are flattened, and when I take the balance staff off the balance wheel, there's also some rust and some stuff here. And this is basically the reason for the long time it took to finish this watch and the video. I had to get a new balance. It would have been an option as well to simply get a new staff, but honestly, after spending so much time on this watch, I was a little bit tired of it, and better to save time and getting a new balance instead. So let's get on with the assembly. Uh-oh. We have another tiny problem. And that is that the jewel in the main plate for the pallet fork is cracked. So we're going to use our lovely little Horia tool to press that jewel out, and then we're going to have to measure it and find a replacement. And yes, Norwegians and watchmakers are these huge Hulk-like monsters, but we do treat these tiny little things. So this jewel measures 1 millimeter across, but we also need to know how big the hole in the middle is. So then we have to measure the pivot of the pallet fork. And that pivot is 0.1 millimeter. And with that information we can order the proper jewel size and receive it. And then we can press that new jewel into the plate again. We might have to adjust the end shake a little bit. So the end shake is how much the pallet fork can move up and down, if you will, between the two jewel holes. I'm not going to show that. In the end, it seems to be okay. So let's get back to the main attraction. We're going to start with assembling the winding system. One thing that complicates this whole assembly is that we had to clean up all the screws as well. Normally when you have this many screws, it is a good habit to leave them in position in situ. But that's of course not possible if they're rusted and you need to clean them up. So yes, I did have to go a little bit back and forth, try a few different screws sometimes, because this whole movement has probably around 50 screws, 40-50 screws. And some of them are very similar, but not identical. So getting the train back together first. Want to make sure everything is running freely before we tighten down the screws. And obviously the rest of the assembly is going to go without any kind of issues whatsoever. So the base movement is pretty straightforward, so I don't have to talk a lot about that. Probably makes some people happy, talking less. But we're almost ready for the time grapher. Just gonna lubricate a little bit in the keyless works and also the various pivots. And then we can put in our fresh new balance. And I'm sure it's gonna run spectacularly. And yes, it does. It runs spectacularly slow. And the beat error is pretty spectacular as well. Before trying to do anything about it, let's just see if we can regulate it to run at a decent rate. Because if not, we're going to have to vibrate the mainspring, and that's another Pandora's box. But yes, we can make it run fairly well. So then we're going to have to adjust the beat error. We're going to have to do this the old way of simply moving the collet on the balance staff ever so slightly. And then, miracle of miracles, and I'm not kidding you, I actually managed to get it down to 0.0 after one try. And that is not skill, that is pure luck. But we take it. I guess the gods wanted to give me a little bit of relief after all the problems with this watch. But normally we have to do that a couple of times to get it within about 1 millisecond bit rate, or bit error rather. With that, we put on the seconds pinion and the driving wheel for the seconds pinion. And then we can commence with calendar works. And boy, is there a lot of work in that calendar. Let's first put on the time setting parts, the time setting train. See some discoloration there, but that's all right. We did have this discussion before also on the necessity for a mechanical watch to be accurate, and especially a vintage one. Of course, a watch should show the time to reasonable accuracy, but this was never a chronometer, When new, it would probably be showing time to about 15 seconds off per day. So we're going to be very happy if it can still do that 70 years later and 70 kilos of rust later. We see most of these parts actually cleaned up pretty well. Most important thing is that there is no rust or corrosion where it matters. Some visual discoloration is not a problem. But if there is rust, for instance, on a surface that needs to be very frictionless, then that would be an issue. So that's why we test all these different parts that need to move, that they do move freely. Now when you have a watch like this with multiple parts of a date changing over, you actually do not want them to change over at the exact same time. Some watches even have, let's say, built-in mechanisms to assure they don't. But the reason you want to spread it out a little bit, and when I say a little bit, I mean a few minutes, is that each wheel that has to flip over another wheel and so forth does require a little bit of force from the mainspring. And when force is taken from the mainspring for these functions, it also means there's less power for the timekeeping. And if you have issues with a watch, especially a watch that has been damaged like this, then you want to make sure you don't get all that power taken away at the same time. This little plate here has no function besides just supporting the dial. With all these wheels in place, let's make sure they rotate as they should when time train is moving, and that looks fine. For all these various parts that have a little bit of friction between them, we use either D5 or similar, or for instance 9504 if there's metal parts really rubbing hard against each other. But there are a lot of springs and correctors and moving parts in a triple calendar watch. That's also what makes them cool, of course, and fun to work on, mostly. And let me know in the comments if you notice an error I made, that a part suddenly changed position a little bit. Let's then check that all discs move as they should. What is worth noting is that the month does not flip over automatically. That is quite common with these old triple calendar watches. What, you might say? How could they? But then again, even in a modern watch with a month showing, you would have to manually correct the date 5 out of 12 months. So it's not that big a deal, to be honest. And you might even say that it makes for a more personal connection with the watch, that you have to manually adjust it every now and then. Alright, having tested all the correctors, we can put the dial back on, and it is a nice dial. let's turn to the case and the crystal rather. We're gonna have to put in the new crystal, and with this type of bezel, we bend the crystal down and then we press the bezel up onto the crystal. Snap. Relatively simple operation, and crystals are probably the best and cheapest investment to make a watch look much better. Let's then case the watch. When you have a watch with a lot of correctors like this, it's very common that there's also a little guiding pin for the movement in the case. So you have to make sure those are also well aligned. For the hands, this central date, you can put it anywhere you want. Well, not really anywhere. Don't put it in your pocket, for instance. But as long as it lines up against the date, it doesn't really matter because it only flips over once per day. And then we find when the weekday flips over in this case, and then we put the hour hand to midnight at that point. And the date should flip over at midnight, give or take 15 minutes. And honestly, we should be able to get it better than 15. So this was at about 10, but when the watch is running, it's going to flip over a few minutes later even, so that's okay. Checking that the correctors work, the moon phase worked before also, and the date works, and the month works. That is good to see. So that means we're finally ready with the watch. Uh-oh. Not so fast, buddy. If you didn't see it and look at the seconds hand, it is jumping all over the place. So we're going to adjust this little spring that keeps the tension on the seconds pinion so that it runs smoothly. And when we've done that, it should look much better. And this is a common issue with watches that have this type of seconds pinion. So you'll see that with a lot of vintage WCs and Omegas and so forth. But the fix is relatively easy. And with that, we can put the watch on the wrist. And that is a beautiful watch. It does give you a sense of accomplishment to make this type of damaged watch look nice and run well again. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then sharing it on social media, clicking like and subscribe will really help the channel. We'll be back with another video shortly. Until then, ta-ta.